If you've watched my recent video on what monks read in early medieval England, or even if you just know a little bit about medieval learning in general, you'll know that Latin was extremely important for any would-be intellectual of that time. If you know a bit about how monasteries and convents worked, and you've heard of the system of oblates in which children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, were given to these monasteries and convents to be raised in that tradition and that style of life, you might have guessed correctly that Latin education in the intellectual class began very early. And luckily, we have two texts from 10th century England that give us a really good idea of how this education was carried out. In today's video, I'll go over these two texts, I'll read some excerpts, talk about what we can learn from them, and give my recommendation on how to incorporate them into your own learning journey. Stay tuned. Now, I'll start with a quick disclaimer. These resources have the potential to be very helpful and interesting, but they do not constitute my recommendation for the best, quickest way to learn Latin. If you don't care about medieval England and you just came here to learn Latin, I'll have some better resources in the description. These children, and here I'll say boys because we know both of these texts come from a monastery, had three advantages over you which are almost impossible to replicate. One, they started young. Everything is easier when you start learning it at 5 years old. Two, they spent hours and hours on this every day at a rate which is almost impossible to replicate if you have a job or if you're in school with other classes. They did this all day long. Three, they didn't have a choice. Learning Latin was something they were forced to do. We as autodidacts, when something gets hard or boring for us, we just usually stop. For them, if something got hard or boring, they had to continue learning it. The alternative was generally corporal punishment. But it wasn't always so bad, and in some instances, the monks in charge of education put serious effort into effective and efficient learning. The first text we're going to talk about today is called Ælfrici abbatis Colloquia ab Ælfrico bata aucta, or just Ælfric's Colloquy. And it's a series of conversations that the boys would memorize and then practice with the teacher or each other. It was probably written towards the end of the 10th century by the abbot Ælfric of Eynsham, and then expanded by his student Ælfric Bata. Because Ælfric wanted to teach his students a good amount of everyday common Latin vocabulary, he structured the conversations around their quotidian lives. This is exceedingly valuable for us as scholars, as it offers an up-close and sort of unfiltered screenshot of the monastic world for these boys. What were they interacting with and talking about on a daily basis? Let's do some reading. So this is St. John's College manuscript 154 on folio 204 recto, meaning the front side of the folio. And this is where the colloquy begins, with Hanc sententiam Latini sermonis olim Ælfricus abbas composuit. So this series of writings, or this composition in the Latin language, once upon a time, olim Ælfricus abbas, Ælfric the abbot, composuit. He's the one that wrote it. You'll notice right off the bat, there are all these tildes above the letters. So A, I, and O have a tilde. This means that there's something missing that the scribe has left out. In these first three instances, it's an M. So hanc sententiam, olim, composuit. The scribe has just left out the M and wrote a squiggle line above the vowel in order to save time. Here, qui meus fuit magister, sed tamen ego Ælfric bata multas postea huic addedi appendices. So qui, this Q with a dot over it, is cui, that is the one or which or who. Meus fuit magister, he was my teacher. And here this line is indicating that the EU in meus has been sort of left out. Meus fuit magister, sed tamen, and here the tilde means the en in tamen, however, has been left out. Sed tamen, however, ego Ælfric bata, I, Ælfric bata, multas postea huic addedi appendices. I added sort of many appendices to it. Here's another manuscript of the same text, which I find a bit more interesting. This is Cotton Manuscript Tiberius A. Tertius, folio 60 verso, meaning the back side of the folio. And this is where the actual meat of the colloquy begins, and you'll notice that all of the Latin words, or almost all of them, have Old English written above them as a gloss. So someone, it might have been Ælfric Bata, but we don't know, someone has gone in and cheated, essentially, and written the translation for the Latin in Old English above the words. For the students at the time, this was maybe a godsend, but for us, this is extremely valuable because a lot of these words and expressions that we get in these Old English glosses, we otherwise wouldn't have. There are a lot of everyday things that are discussed only here, and if this glossator hadn't decided to cheat like this, then we wouldn't have them. Even just with the Latin text, though, we can really take a look into the classroom and kind of see what's going on here. So the students begin the colloquy by asking the teacher to teach them Latin, and the teacher responds with a few follow-up questions. One of them is here. Vultis flagellari indiscendo. So here, vultis, this is an S. This one often trips students up, but this right here is not an F or something like that. It's an S. Vultis flagellari indiscendo. So here another S, and then this is a sort of proto question mark. The question is, do you want to be beaten in learning? That is, will you sort of suffer corporal punishment while you're learning Latin? And the students respond something along the lines of like, we don't want to be beaten, but we understand that if we have to learn, then that's just the way that it is. And that tells you all you need to know, that this was written by the teacher and not the students. I'll switch here to a printed version just because it's easier to read. This is also online and free. All of these links will be in the description. There are a lot of really great moments in the colloquy. Some of them are really funny, like when the teacher kicks the cook out of the monastery and when the carpenter and the blacksmith have an argument with each other. There are some really interesting ones where the boy describes that he gets up every morning and goes to the bathroom, and that happens to be the only part that's not glossed by the Old English. And then there's this part, which I thought was really interesting and I wanted to read. The teacher is just asking one of the boys, what he does with his life. And one of the questions is, et quid bibis? What do you drink, in your daily life? And the answer is, on this side, there are two different manuscripts that differ here, but this left one I'm going to stick with here. Cervisam vel medonem sive hydromellum, quod est mulsum, seulac si non habeo cervisam. Cervisam, that is beer, vel medonem. What is medonem? Now, medonem is mead. Sive hydromellum, which is the Latin word for mead. Quod est mulsum. Et mulsum is honey wine. Seu lac, or milk, if I don't have beer. Si non habeo cervisam. So these boys in a monastery, sometimes as young as 5 years old, are supposed to answer the question by saying that they drink beer or mead. And if they don't have beer, they'll drink milk. But generally they drink beer. He goes on to ask, non ne bibis vinum? And the boy doesn't say, no, I don't drink wine, I'm only 7 years old. He says, non sum tam dives, I'm not that rich. I can't afford to just go out and buy wine and drink it. He also says, non est potus puerorum sive stultorum, it's not a drink for boys or idiots, sed sanum et sapientium, but for old men and for wise men. So these boys in this monastery, they could drink beer, they could drink mead, they could not drink wine. And the primary reason why they can't drink wine is that it seems to be set aside for older and wiser men. That is a sort of touch of class. You boys can drink the mead and the beer. Us learned old men will have our wine. This colloquy can be effective as a learning tool for us 1,000 years later in the same way it was for Ælfric's students. If you'd like to learn Latin in the exact same way as these boys did, I suggest memorizing parts of the text, learning what the words mean as you go, and I'll have an English translation linked in the description to help with that. If you're learning with a friend, you could have one person memorize the part of the teacher and one person memorize the part of the students. And if you're learning by yourself, you could record the questions with spaces in between, and then play that recording back for yourself, and then recite the answers as you go. If you want to be ultra realistic, every time you make a mistake, you can smack yourself in the face. I don't actually recommend this though. The next work to talk about is Ælfric's Grammar, which is again written by the abbot Ælfric of Eynsham in the late 10th century. It's essentially an Old English edition of the Latin grammars written by Aelius Donatus and Priscian the grammarian, and it seems to have been used as an instructional tool by Ælfric and his fellow Latin teachers. In modern language learning, especially in Latin, grammar is used to teach the language. This was not, however, always the case, and teaching Latin students grammar early on in general is actually a rather new concept. In medieval learning, grammar was part of the trivium, along with logic and rhetoric, and so was considered a very cerebral topic and something that helped you understand the world. It was not used as a guideline for sentence formulation or a learning tool for Latin until Ælfric of Eynsham publishes the first vernacular Latin grammar that we know of in the late 10th century. Ælfric was very seriously invested in raising a new generation of good Latinists, and to achieve this, he attempted to make Latin grammar easily accessible to young learners by writing descriptions of how it worked in their language, which was Old English. In doing so, he hoped to prevent common mistakes made by his contemporaries in Latin, especially in biblical Latin, and in the preface to his book, he famously says, "Stavkraft is seo kai." Grammar is the key to understanding Latin literature. Let's read a section. So this is Cambridge manuscript HH 110, folio 79 recto, right in the middle of the grammar. And one of the more interesting sections right here, he mentions the Latin pronoun is, meaning he, and then he talks about it a bit and compares it to a feature of Old English. So he says, is, se, and again, remember, this is an S, se, is subjunctivum. So again, we've got a missing M with this tilde here. But he's saying that the pronoun he is either subjunctivum, which in modern English we would say subjunctive, but it doesn't have the same meaning that subjunctive does in modern English grammar conventions. Here it just it means what you might literally think subjunctive to mean. And he continues saying, "Thatis under theodend leech." So just a reminder, in manuscripts, they generally don't really care about keeping words on one line, and they're very happy to just cut a word off halfway through and just continue on the next line. Under theodend leech is Ælfric's attempt to translate subjunctivum into Old English. He continues by saying othe relativum, again with a missing M right here with his tilde. That is edlesendlich, and edlesendlich is his literal translation of relativum. So he's saying that the pronoun can either be subjunctivum, subjunctive, or relativum, relative. He explains himself here. Forthamthe he nemai beun after richte queden buton that ondiet beu for side. Forthamthe, because, he nemai, he can't, that is, the pronoun can't be after richte jequeden, correctly said. So he's referring here after richte, that is the sort of right way to talk. After richte jequeden, this is another missing letter tilde. This word is after. So ash, ft, and then er are missing. Henemai beun after richte jequeden buton, except that ondiet beu for je side. The sort of meaning has already been said. That ondiet beu for je side. And if you haven't seen the video where I explain this letter, this is a contraction meaning that. So here we've got a thorn and then a T added on top of it. So that means that. Buton that ondiet beu for side. Except when the meaning of the pronoun has already been said. Swaak, he continues, comparing it to English. Swaak on Englishere sprache. So also in the Old English language, on Englishere sprache. Ne quath non mon se, buton he sum thinge be tham men sprake. So no one says say, which is again the Old English word meaning sort of like that one or he, except they already have said something about that person. So buton he sum thinge be tham men sprake. And this is true in English, in both modern and Old English. Unless you can actually point to something, you can't say that unless everyone already knows what you mean by that. So Ælfric is using Old English to explain a Latin feature. This text is much less useful for learning Latin, and even if you know Old English well, it's really nothing more than a curiosity for the modern reader. That is, in my experience, reading grammar textbooks is a really ineffective method of learning a language. And what we have to remember is that even though Ælfric's students probably did benefit from this text, most of the Latin education that he was carrying out was probably conducted in Latin, or at least using comprehensible input like the colloquy that we discussed earlier. In that way, Ælfric was really in line with a lot of modern language learning pedagogy. Like I said, if you want to learn Latin, check out the resources that I have linked in the description. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. If you like this kind of content, check out the rest of the channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Farathie Yesunde.